Hey family, welcome back to the Clarity Pivot with Tavares Bussy. I'm your grateful host, Tavares. This is the space where I talk through the things that matter to me, the messy things, the honest things, the things we whisper about but rarely name out loud. There's no set order to these episodes. It's whatever clarity life shows me in the moment. It may seem random, but the purpose remains steady: to grow, to heal, and to bring you along with me if you're willing to go. This Clarity Pivot specifically addresses Black Greek letter organizations, Christianity, and the growing trend of condemning and denouncing them in the name of faith. Its goal is to promote understanding of personal commitments, beliefs, and decisions rather than provoking debate or outrage. The focus is on approaching this from a non-judgmental perspective, encouraging healthy dialogue over heated arguments. Now, let's pivot. Do Christians have to denounce Greek life? I want to first start by saying this plainly. I do not believe there is a Christian requirement to denounce Black Greek letter organizations. This is something that's going to be foundational in this argument for this episode, so I need to make that clear. As far as I'm concerned, that belief of its requirement is not rooted in scripture, history, or sound theology. It is rooted in fear, misunderstanding, and in some cases, a fundamentalist framework that struggles with nuance. Black Greek letter organizations are not spiritual institutions. They do not claim spiritual authority. They do not offer salvation. They do not compete with God. They are social, civic, academic, and service-based organizations. That distinction matters. Historically speaking, Christian theology defines idolatry not as involvement with things, but as giving ultimate devotion to something that is not God. Idolatry is about displacement, not participation. Anything can become an idol: money, ministry, marriage, politics, even church itself. The problem is never the organization. The problem is the misordering of devotion. Now let's take a dive into my own story. A personal disclosure and my testimony. Right through here, I want to be transparent in this conversation because clarity requires honesty. I am a proud member of the Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. I say that plainly and without apology, not as a flex, not as a defense, but as context around this conversation in this episode. My journey to Phi Beta Sigma was not linear. I began an undergraduate experience that did not come to completion due to a personal emergency that had nothing to do with the organization itself. Life intervened, priorities shifted, and I made peace with the idea that it simply was not meant to be. Years later, after getting settled into my career, moving to Connecticut, getting a new found friendships and connections towards the end of 2017, I found myself praying a very specific prayer. I asked God to reveal the unfinished things, not unfinished goals, but unfinished assignments. Things I had abandoned, not because they were wrong, but because life interrupted them. In that season of prayer and reflection, Phi Beta Sigma resurfaced. Not as nostalgia, not as ego, but as clarity. I listened, I discerned, and I moved forward. Since becoming a member, my life has elevated in ways I cannot fully explain, but can clearly recognize. My leadership sharpened, my sense of service deepened, and most importantly, my community expanded. And at no point during all of that was my Christianity disrupted, diluted, or displaced. Why? Because I never made the organization my worship. I never confused brotherhood with divinity. My devotions stayed in order, and that was on purpose. History and context. Black Greek letter organizations emerged in the early 20th century alongside Black churches, historically Black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs, and mutual aid societies. All of these institutions developed within the same ecosystem of survival. They were responses to exclusion, violence, and deliberate marginalization, not rebellions against faith or God. At that time, the Black church was not just a spiritual center, it was a schoolhouse, a bank, a political organizing space. And HBCUs, they were not just places of learning. They were sanctuaries for Black intellect and brilliance in a country that criminalized Black thought. Mutual aid societies existed because Black people could not rely on white institutions for protection, health care, burial, or economic support. Black Greek letter organizations entered the same landscape. They were not attempting to replace the church. They were addressing a different need: brotherhood and sisterhood among the Black educated class, leadership development, academic excellence, and structured service. Networks of support in a world that systematically denied Black people access to power was the purpose of Black Greek letter organizations. These organizations were not created as religious movements. Let me say that again. These organizations were not created as religious movements. They were not found as alternative spiritual systems. They were intentionally secular in function, even while existing in deeply religious communities. And it does matter that many of the founders of these organizations were Christians, not culturally Christian, but actively church-going pastors, deacons, elders, educators, and community leaders who were shaped by Black theological traditions. If these organizations were inherently anti-Christian, that contradiction would be impossible to ignore in the historical record. But it isn't there. What is there is a pattern of Black institutions forming to meet different needs within the same oppressed community: church for spiritual grounding, schools for intellectual survival, mutual aid for material care, and Greek organizations for leadership, service, and collective advancement. Now, we must be clear. History and context matters here. Because when we strip these institutions of that context, of that history, imaginations and conspiracy theories start to fill the gaps. And imagination, when untethered from evidence, almost always turns into fear, and that is by design. Myths, secrecy, and symbolism. Now we got to talk about the myths. And in order to do that honestly, we got to talk about where these myths came from. Now, get your pens and paper out because we are about to go deep. Much of the denouncement trend is not new. It did not originate on social media. It did not emerge from deep theological study. It traces back to broader movements of religious fear that have cycled through Black American Christianity for decades. In the late 20th century, particularly during the era often referred to as the Satanic Panic, large portions of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity became deeply suspicious of anything symbolic, secretive, or ritualized outside the church. Fraternities, sororities, Halloween, role-playing games, rock music, yoga, meditation, and even certain children's cartoons and books were all framed as spiritually dangerous. Not because of evidence, but because of imagination fueled by fear. That same logic migrated into Black church spaces, especially through imported fundamentalist teachings, pamphlets, sermons, and later DVDs and online videos that warned of hidden covenants, secret oaths, and demonic symbolism. Greek letter organizations became easy targets, not because they were uniquely dangerous, but because they were visible, structured, and misunderstood in their own faults. One of the most persistent accusations centers on secrecy. The assumption is that if something is not fully accessible to outsiders, it must be dark or demonic. That logic does not hold up historically or biblically. Organizations maintain privacy for identity, continuity, and trust. Universities do it, courts do it, families do it, churches do it. And if you were to be a scholar in your biblical studies, even Jesus at times spoke in parables and disclosed certain teachings only to his disciples. Privacy is not inherently evil. It is organizational. Then there's this fixation on this concept of rituals. In fear-based theology, the word ritual becomes shorthand for worship, sacrifice, or allegiance to something other than God. But ritual simply means repeated symbolic action. Weddings are rituals, graduations are rituals, funerals are rituals. Communion itself is a ritual. Ritual does not equal worship, and symbolism does not automatically mean spiritual devotion. This next concept is probably the most conflated argument used, and it's probably to me the funniest. The mythology argument is perhaps the most imaginative and least grounded. Greek letters, names, and terminology are academic and linguistic, not theological. Greek was historically the language of scholarship, philosophy, and higher education. Greek letter organizations do not practice Greek religion. We do not invoke ancient gods or teach mythology as a belief. That claim has no historical support. What we are often witnessing is not discernment, but pattern seeking fueled by fear. Symbols become suspicious, structure becomes sinister, tradition becomes theology, and imagination replaces evidence and evokes fear. Let me be clear. Symbols are not deities. Structure is not spirituality, and organizations are not churches. When we trace these accusations back to their root, what we find is not revelation, but recycled panic. And fear, when left unchecked, is a very good thing at disguising itself as holiness. Why is this only a Black conversation? There's a countercultural nuance here that deserves a little bit of our attention. White fraternities and sororities exist in abundance. They also have secrecy, symbolism, and they have ritual. Yet there is no widespread movement in white Christian spaces demanding their spiritual denouncement. That disparity matters. Black institutions are often scrutinized differently, spiritualized differently, burdened with moral panic in ways that are not evenly applied. This pattern shows up across Black music, Black joy, Black ambition, and Black community spaces. Naming this does not mean people who denounce Greek life are acting in bad faith. What someone does with their spiritual life is none of my business, it's none of your business, it's none of our business. But when misinformation becomes communal pressure, when fear replaces theology, and when history is rewritten to justify suspicion, clarity is required. Some additional clarity, making room for those who walk away. I also want to be clear about something else, because clarity also requires empathy and it requires compassion. See, for me, there is space for people who decide to step away from Greek letter organizations. There is space for people who denounce their affiliation as part of their own spiritual journey. That choice is valid. Personal convictions deserve respect. You see, some people have experienced harm. Some people have wrestled with misordered devotion. Some people have realized that what once served them no longer does. Walking away can be an act of honesty and growth. You see, what I am challenging is not the decision itself, but the foundation of the decision. When departure is rooted in reflection, accountability, and discernment, we should all honor that. But when it is rooted in fear, conspiracy, theological misinformation, or a desire to condemn others who make the choice to remain, that deserves serious interrogation. Not condemnation, but examination for sure. You see, you don't need to demonize an institution to grow beyond it. You do not need to rewrite history to justify your own choice to heal. And you do not need to frame your exit as spiritual warfare in order for it to be spiritually meaningful. Growth does not require delusion. Faith does not require fear. And obedience does not require public denunciation. There is room for those who stay. There's also room for those who leave. What matters is that the choice is made honestly, thoughtfully, and without harming or belittling others in the process. This is what mature faith looks like. Before we go any further, let me pause right here. If this conversation is giving you language, clarity, or permission to think more deeply about your faith and your identity, stay connected. Follow, subscribe, and share the Clarity Pivot wherever you listen to podcasts. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or iHeartRadio. We'll be right back. This episode is sponsored by TJB Solutions, supporting education, graphic design, podcasting, and professional and creative writing. If you need clarity in your brand, your school community, or your creative projects, TJB Solutions is ready to support your vision. For more information, contact us at tjbsolutions100@gmail.com. The algorithm is louder than the reality. We also need to be honest about how this looks online and scale. If we follow statistics, Black Greek letter organizations represent a small fraction of the Black population. Yet, social media has managed to make this conversation feel massive. That distortion has a name. Media scholars refer to it as rage baiting. Content that provokes fear, anger, or moral urgency travels faster online than content rooted in proportion or context. Rage baiting does not mean the concern is fake. It just means the scale is distorted. A small issue can feel enormous when it is emotionally engineered to stay in your face. So a niche conversation becomes framed as a spiritual emergency. Loud starts to feel large. Visible starts to feel dominant. When theology is formed in algorithmic environments, fear often feels, looks, and is framed to be just like faith. And this is something that we all need to be aware of. Theological clarity and honest critique. This episode is not about defending or upholding Greek life blindly. We all know there is history of hazing, elitism, colorism, and misplaced loyalty, and those things deserve accountability and interrogation. But abuse does not equal inherent spiritual corruption. Churches have had to confront the same realities. You don't hear people arguing that abuse in the church prove Christianity itself is demonic. Scripture condemns idolatry, not affiliation. It warns against misplaced devotion, not structured community. And that discrepancy needs to be identified. Discernment is not denunciation. God does not compete with organizations that were never trying to be him. The danger is not Greek life. The danger is shallow theology that mistakes superstition for holiness. You can follow God without demonizing history. You can also walk away quietly without declaring spiritual warfare. And you can love God deeply without fearing structure. Clarity does not require agreement. It requires truth. You can join the conversation with me across platforms at Tavares Teaches. Same handle everywhere. And if you want to reflect more deeply between episodes, subscribe to my Substack. That's where I share thoughts that don't always fit into the microphone. There, you'll find exclusive insights, early and bonus episodes, and reflections that I only share with my Substack subscription community. Also, keep an eye out for the Clarity Journal, a guided space to think, feel, and choose with intention at every pivot. This community grows because we grow together. Please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform, share it with a friend, like it, and leave a comment to share how this episode resonated with you. Thanks for listening. Move with intention, love with boundaries, and always choose peace as if your soul depends on it. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you at the next Clarity Pivot.